We are living in a world in which talk of artificial intelligence seems omnipresent, and in which AI has transitioned from a niche technological development to a fundamental, invisible, and often overwhelming infrastructure of daily life. One interesting aspect is the recent development and marketing of new machine listening apps that use voice data and related audio to make inferences about people. These can include inferences about their mental health, medical profile, and wellness. What does this mean for privacy, for consent, and for rights protection? I'm Jim Turk, the director of the Center for Free Expression, and before I introduce our panel, I want to acknowledge that the land in which I am speaking to you tonight is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I want to thank the co-sponsor of tonight's panel, the Infoscape Research Lab at Toronto Metropolitan University. And now I'd like to introduce our panelists. The first is Stephen J. Neville. Stephen is a PhD candidate in the Joint Graduate Program in Communication and Culture at York University and at Toronto Metropolitan University. Currently, Stephen is a principal investigator for a project titled Losing Your Voice to AI, funded by the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, a project that maps the emerging industry of health-related machine listening. Welcome, Stephen.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Our second panelist is Beth Semel. Beth is an assistant professor of anthropology at Princeton University. Her research examines the sociopolitical life of computational voices analysis technologies, especially those designed to track and evaluate people experiencing mental distress. Welcome, Beth.
Hey, thanks, Jim.
And our third panelist is Joseph Turow. Joseph is the Robert Louis Shayon Professor of Media Systems and Industries, Emeritus, at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. Among his other achievements in his long distinguished career is having written 13 books and edited 5 others. His 14th book, The Problem with Personalization, How Advertisers Learn to Make and Break Us from Ancient Times to AI, is being published by the University of Chicago Press this year. Welcome, Joseph. Our moderator is James Parker. James is Associate Professor of Law at the Institute for International Law and the Humanities at the University of Melbourne. Since 2020, he has been working with curator Joel Stern and artist Shayon on machine listening, a platform for research, sharing, and artistic experimentation focused on the critique of new and emerging forms of listening grounded in artificial intelligence and machine learning. Welcome, James.
Hello, pleasure to be here.
Now, for the audience, we don't use the chat in this version of Zoom, but we do want to have you participate in the conversation tonight. And so after the panel has been having his conversation for 45, 50 minutes or so, James is going to turn to the audience for questions, and he'll call on Ange Holmes, who's the coordinator of the Center for Free Expression, to read out the questions. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button, a little box with a Q&A underneath it and a question mark in the middle of it. So at any point during the conversation, if you hear something that you'd like to ask a question about to one of the panelists or all of them, please just click on that little square and write out your question. Don't wait till James turns to the audience. You can just do that as you're listening to him so the questions aren't forgotten and can be dealt with when the panel turns to the audience. So that's all for me. Over to you guys.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, so I'm going to be hosting, and as Jim said, my name is James Parker. I'm based in Melbourne, where I live and work on unceded Wurundjeri land. I just want to add to the acknowledgement of country and of elders past and present, as well as any Indigenous folks in the audience today or in the future. As Jim said, I'm in a law faculty. I work on questions of law and sound and listening, and recently machine listening. And the topic for today is a particular subset of machine listening, voice. or voice analytics, voice intelligence. It goes by a number of different names. And so the sort of rough trajectory for the session today is to start off with a bit of ground clearing. We're going to introduce the state of the field together, define a few key terms. We're going to work through some examples before moving on to talk about consent and some of the other political and legal dimensions of voice analytics, moving maybe towards the future where things are headed and maybe what can be done to head off certain eventualities we maybe don't want to see come about before moving on to audience questions. But the idea is to keep things relatively loose and informal, so we're going to be moving between each other quite fluidly, I hope. To kick things off, I just want to kind of, begin to open up what kinds of things we might be talking about when we talk about the application of AI to voices. And I suppose the first thing to say is that for many people, the first thing that's going to come to mind is some kind of automated system that can understand the content of speech. So what you're saying, what I'm saying right now. And as it happens, some of the very earliest work in AI, dating way back to the 1950s, was trying to do precisely this. In speech recognition, work on speech recognition, funded mostly in the US by Bell Labs, the telecoms company that at the time was one of, if not the biggest companies in the world, and also DARPA, the research arm of the US military. And so a lot of this early research in AI was to do with voice and was to do with understanding the semantic content of speech, what people were saying. And so for Bell, the commercial application here was call routing. They wanted to build a system basically that could automatically identify people saying numbers, maybe a few key phrases, so they could sack a whole bunch of call operators. And that's exactly what they did eventually in 1992, firing about 6,000 human operators in the first tranche after the introduction of their automated system. By the 1970s, IBM, which by this point is the biggest computer company in the world, starts working on automated dictation and transcription tools. And here they're trying to automate secretarial labor, basically, which incidentally, or maybe not coincidentally, is another feminized profession. And the first automatic dictation tools are released in 1994, but still the public doesn't have a kind of very substantial interaction with automated voice technologies. Even with the Snowden revelations in 2013, which revealed that in concert with big tech, the US government and its allies, are hoovering up vast volumes of intercepted telephone calls, automatically transcribing them, searching them for so-called national security purposes. Even then in 2013, most of the analysis is focused on the content of speech. And so it's really in the last 10 to 15 years that we're starting to see a really dramatic expansion of the kinds of information that can be automatically extracted from people's voices beyond the content of what they're saying. And this happens to coincide, I think, with the introduction of voice interfaces, increasingly into people's homes and pockets, with the rollout of voice assistants like Siri and Alexa, smart speakers like Amazon Echo and Google Home. And these things are now literally available on billions of devices, right? Literally every laptop, every smartphone, earbuds, headphones, TVs, cars, fridges, dishwashers, light bulbs. Every one of these either is doing or is capable of doing automated voice analytics. And that is kind of just the tip of the iceberg in a certain way, because there are also many less visible, less known about elements of the voice intelligence industry that we're going to get into today. So with that kind of potted history behind us, I thought we could start off by bringing in Stephen, partly because you convened this panel around the time you produced this report for the Infoscape Research Lab, which attempts to detail and lay out some of the many other ways that voice data is now being used by states and corporations, and their privacy implications in particular. So Stephen, could you maybe kick us off by saying a little bit about some of the different kinds of voice analytics that you describe in that report, maybe the political rationale for that report, just to sort of open up for the audience some of the many and diverse ways in which AI is being applied to voice in the present.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, James. I think it's helpful to just quickly start by grounding how AI systems kind of approach voice. Like an easy way to think of it is what we do in everyday life, right? We might hear in the voice of a loved one that they sound a bit down, depressed, or maybe we make assumptions about a colleague whose voice sounds a bit hoarse. We assume they're fatigued or something else. The physiology starts getting affected by like vocal cords functioning a bit differently. Maybe the person has a cold. These sorts of things. The same kind of inferences are being targeted through AI systems in much more refined and invisible ways, I guess. And this also starts to target voice beyond speech production, targeting more of a body voice that involves this shared physiology involved in vocal production. So things like our lungs, our vocal tract. So the report details a set of apps, many which look at voice, but some of which analyze sounds of breathing patterns or cry sounds of infants. Others that are self-tracking tools that you'd use while you're sleeping to monitor sounds of snoring or sleep talk. So what the report really was trying to communicate in a public register was a research project that we're working on is mapping this industry of voice and para-voice related machine listening, specifically for health inferences. And it really is occurring in, as you mentioned, like with this diffuse infrastructure. So it's leveraging that, and as a result, it's starting to expand in all sorts of settings with different privacy concerns and other social risks. Like there's workplace monitoring tools by companies like Sond Health, which are meant to be wellness monitoring systems for things like employee burnout. And there's all sorts of call center applications, which Joe's an expert on. For instance, a company called Empath AI is integrating cognitive impairment detection technology in customer contact centers. So these are the kinds of things that are occurring, and I guess in terms of like the political moment, it's really a key time to be having this dialogue, especially in a Canadian context. We have new privacy and AI legislation that's about to be introduced, and there's a widespread concern amongst civil society organizations about a really rushed and hurried public consultation approach. So this dialogue I see as being a great way to really center these kinds of concerns around the sensitivity of voice.
Thanks so much, Stephen. A really helpful overview. Maybe we could pivot to like the fine detail because Beth, you're really one of the leading experts on voice analytics in health contexts. You've done this kind of amazingly fine-grained ethnographic work. And I guess I was wondering if you could tell us a little more about some of the kinds of things you study, especially because to me, these feel like they're not so well known. Maybe we have a dim awareness that our kind of affect or maybe the fact that we cough can be identified. But what you're getting at in your research, what you're studying, are less well-known companies doing much more finely grained things with quite worrying potential implications. So could you just describe to us, maybe lay out some key terms for what it is you study, and I think that would really be a great way into the health voice conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much, James. I'm also losing my voice, which is always kind of meta and, performative when that happens that I'm talking about these things. But Stephen actually laid a really great groundwork for me to kind of talk in more detail about the particular type of technologies that I study. And really, so the type of technologies that I study are vocal biomarker AI. And a vocal biomarker is basically everything that Stephen just described, all of these technologies, doing the kind of mapping that, as you so nicely put it, humans sort of do all the time. Um, the way that he put it of they're trying to do this mapping in a more fine-grained manner is a way of saying that really the kind of scientific premise behind all of these technologies is the concept of a vocal biomarker. Um, and as the name implies, a vocal biomarker is in the kind of broadest sense a voice-based biological marker of some sort of disease. A maybe more like classic or tangible example of a biomarker would be a biomarker that's found in the blood. So let's say you're at the doctor for a routine screening, they'll take a blood test. They'll be looking for something in your blood that indicates the present that you do or do not have some sort of disease progression taking place in your body. Um, the sort of scientific theory of the vocal biomarker is that you can treat voice as a biological substance in the same way that you would treat something like the blood and find within it these minute, very subtle signs that are directly connected to some sort of biological process. It maybe makes a little bit more sense to think about this in the context of something like Parkinson's disorder, which is a neurodegenerative disorder that impacts speech motor control. So if you think about it, as Stephen was saying, the kind of anatomical physiological systems involved in the production of speech, when you have something like Parkinson's, the kind of classic symptom of that is the impacting of the coordination of those systems, which leads to when someone has a more progressed version of Parkinson's, a kind of telltale vocal quality. And so the idea of vocal biomarker research is that it might be possible to kind of capture those signs in the voice prior to that moment of disease progression when a human ears could be able to distinguish the difference by using complex statistical methods to analyze the voice for those kind of bodily signs, signs that something is happening in the body long before the kind of full-fledged symptom progression. The area of research that I've been focusing on has been vocal biomarker AI used in mental health care. Stond Health is one of the companies that kind of originally started out with a more sort of narrowly biomedical focus, trying to come up with techniques to optimize mental health screening by transforming it from like a long and subjective conversation, which is how mental health screening is usually carried out, to something that's much more compressed and more similar to a blood test, more of a kind of straightforward transaction of a substance, speech, and then some kind of conclusion being drawn about that substance. But as James mentioned, part of the work that I did, a large part of the work that I did was joining academic research labs who are really sort of doing this work kind of prior to the commercialization of this very narrow sub area and kind of prior to the proliferation of the sorts of apps and software suites that Stephen is talking about. And so that enabled me to get a better sense of I guess sort of what happens behind the scenes, which, as it turns out, behind the scenes, making these technologies actually ends up requiring a lot of the same things that happen in, for instance, sort of regular mental health screening. So it requires a great deal of highly subjective human labor. And I appreciate, James, you referencing the role that voice analysis technologies have played in replacing feminized labor, because that's also very much a part of the story of vocal biomarker AI, because behind the scenes to create the technology, you oftentimes have clinicians, social workers doing the kind of communicative or listening work that they would do in a normal setting. And kind of tacking AI onto that concept really is in many ways a kind of bait and switch that directs attention away from the fact that there's quite a few humans in the loop doing work that's not necessarily considered very valuable or highly skilled, that's necessary to making these technologies function.
Can I jump in, Beth, and ask like what the kind of state of this field is? Like, we're going to come to Joe in a moment, who's going to talk about, smart speakers and call centers and AI voice agents and so on, which as everyone knows, are kind of in every car and every home, every pocket, the biggest companies in the world behind them. Now, like, how sort of far along are these technologies in kind of commercial applications? Like, does this work? Are these happening? Are these kind of analytics being applied to us without our knowledge, or is it more nascent, more kind of future oriented?
Yeah, so I think the fact that like Stephen was able to name a company that is really a kind of prime player in the vocal biomarker AI scene speaks to the fact that these technologies, I would say, are much more they're much more prolific than they were when I started my fieldwork about 10 years ago. But they are not necessarily present to the public, or they're kind of there, but in a sort of way that's maybe not as transparent or clear as to what's happening. So a lot of the kind of companies that were starting up around the time I started my field work ended up pivoting to the customer service call center experience. I know, again, Joe will be talking about call centers, but when you get that automated voice that says this call may be monitored for quality services, that also means, in addition to monitoring the content of your voice, that they're using a technology that's quite similar in its infrastructure and its sort of design principles to the types of technologies that I studied that kind of ended up pivoting to that field, as the sort of healthcare use cases didn't end up being as sort of scientifically robust, let's just say, as people were hoping. But at the same time, despite that scientific robustness, and despite the fact that vocal biomarker AI is pursued by people more on the science side as kind of an ever emerging thing, there are several startups who do, for instance, partner with a private health insurance payers, partner with private mental health care providers to use vocal biomarker AI technologies for things like adjudicating insurance reimbursement coverage, or deciding whether or not, well, in the context of like mental health care practices, using it as a replacement for a traditional sort of intake form to enhance compliance. So the idea is that you can run this in the background of essentially a Zoom interview in a teletherapy context, and have the sort of initial intake form be filled out automatically by the person's voice. So they are present in a way that I would say is not necessarily transparent. And I do think part of it has to do with the way that AI is applied as a kind of underspecified term that really doesn't allow the kind of general public to understand that AI is like, there's many different things that are being cited when AI is sort of put on the table or tacked onto a software suite or a company's product.
If
So
I
is
may
it,
as well,
go on.
if I can jump in, yeah, like in the scan that I conducted, like we identified over 20 small or mid-sized firms that are operating in this space. And that like that small status too is like used as a strategic advantage, right? Because there's less public scrutiny, similar to these call center books. Like Joe, you talk about that in your book, Voice Catchers, about that invisibility. It really breeds some more invasive and risk-taking data practices.
Mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, like some of the firms like Sont Health are making big partnership deals. Like they have one with Qualcomm to integrate this through Snapdragon chips. So the idea is these kinds of voice analytics would be ready to go. You purchase your device and it's ready to be to edge processing for voice analytics. So this would be like a widespread diffusion of this very quickly.
Um, Joe, maybe it's time now to come to you and the kind of this point that Beth has made, that the money isn't necessarily the big money. The truly big money isn't necessarily in health exactly at the moment. Maybe that's coming. The big money seems to be in marketing.
Yeah,
And
in a whole variety of ways, but I think when it comes to marketing, I mean, look at OpenAI. They pivoted to marketing, to advertising, because that's, where they think they have to go to make the money they need to make the trillions of dollars. Advertising tends to be the fallback position. But voice is a scary thing for some companies, and you don't hear a lot about it. When Beth was talking, it made me think of the trauma centers that are taking place around the world, when you may have heard that companies will record what people say in the voice, bots that they have, and then they will send it to various places in the world to listen to see if their AI get the data correctly. And some of it is horrible. It's sexual misconduct, harassment, cursing, and they literally have to get some of those people into therapy once they are involved in listening to people's voices. So this is a major issue that almost nobody talks about. That's the detritus of what happens when you start looking at voice this way.
Speaking of things that people don't talk about, could you maybe tell us a little bit about the call center use of?
The call centers, and I did study this for the voice catchers. I haven't done a whole lot of it recently, but it seems to be going on strong. What companies do is when you phone them, they do a number of things. First of all, they transcribe the voice and use the transcription, but they also will, and so they'll look at the words and the phrases you use. They'll look at your tone, your pitch, your speaking speed. They look for emotional cues, stress, frustration, satisfaction, and they often will put that in databases. And sometimes the companies that do this will have databases that cross a variety of firms that people call. So if you call into them, they might get data about you from another company you called into in order to tell the person you're speaking to now something about how you sound and what you're like and that kind of thing. The idea is often to detect unhappy customers early, to send you to the best agent for certain things, okay, which is a big deal more and more. And also, of course, to coach people in terms of how to deal with people who sound in certain ways. So
is it a performance management tool as well, to be directed back on the employees in the call center?
And they will get instructions on how to do this. But what I've been doing, but it goes beyond this. I mean, call centers are a big deal, but more and more, we're dealing with so many other kinds of media. I don't know how many people speak to their television sets, for example. If you have a smart TV, you're probably encouraged to use the voice aspect of the television set. And you have to consent to a specific agreement in order to do this. And I have an LG, for example, and it says you will not be able to use our voice command function, okay, which allows you to access and control specific functions using your blah, 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 unless you agree. All right. And when you try to figure out what that means, it says voice information refers to voice commands and results of voice commands, which doesn't really tell you much. But it may use voice information that's been collected, they say, in accordance with this agreement, to provide people to provide companies with information about people. Okay, to analyze LG's customers using this functionality in order to improve and develop so-called new smart media product functions. That's at such a high level of description that it's almost meaningless. And yet, if you don't, for example, I didn't click on it, every month or so, I get a reminder from my television set to get in and accept it. Okay.
So you're opening up for us the theme of consent, and obviously the companies involved are very, they're good liberals, and they all want us to believe that we are consenting to all of the kinds of inference and analytics and data sharing.
Well, it's a kind of combination opt-in and opt-out. The biometric stuff is opt-in in a kind of seductive way. It's a combination of seduction and bullying. The opt-out stuff increasingly is becoming seductive too. We could get into a discussion of that if you'd like. But if I may say, and we can go into this in more detail, I don't want to take up the time, with other people, but I would say that in the context of what I look at, which is privacy and ads/media personalization, it's useful to think of voice as part of a panoply of elements that marketers use to profile individuals. So it's not voice alone, it's voice together with a whole lot of things which sort of interact with one another in the results that they get, the profiling. So there's voice, there's location, and location means IP and phone apps and GPS and BLE. There's email use, whether it's voice or typed. There's web searching, voice or typed. There's technologies used, what kind of computer you're using, what kind of phone you're using. There's the body type. When you walk into a store, your gender and age, and sometimes when you talk. There's products bought, there's statements in chats, there's third-party data from outside the internet. All of this is a combination of what people do, what people type, what people say. And we could look at generational differences in terms of and context. When do people talk to machines and when do they type to machines? How have people been socialized in this direction? And all of this profiling takes place across devices increasingly. Okay, and I'll mention a word now that we can get into later. But all of this personalization increasingly is becoming part of agentic commerce, where you have agents that talk and type to you and do your bidding based upon all the information they've received, both audio as well as behavioral.
I mean, that's a pretty scary picture of like a vast sort of network of forms of data collection, and
That's where we're headed.
And I know I completely agree.
Yeah.
But I'm old. I'm also old enough to remember when the network, the Snowden revelations were shocking.
Yeah.
They were really shocking. And I remember I've done some work on the Amazon Echo and the sort of the smart speaker, and they were really, let's say, privacy forward at the time. So they have this thing called the wake word. You have to say Alexa or Hey Siri,
Yeah.
or whatever it is, to your device. Now, the whole rationale of that was that we won't be collecting your speech or your voice data or anything private. We'll only collect with your consent. Now,
Right.
in this era of kind of agentic voice agents, that's gone. I mean, the idea that we have been made to consent now. So, and I know this is something that you've worked on, Stephen. I know it's something that you've worked on, Joe, in terms you're writing on habituation and resignation. And it must be something that you have to confront as well, Beth, in your work in private healthcare context. Can we say a little bit about how in really 10 years, we have been made to consent, convinced to, bullied into consenting to a really breathtaking array of data collection in relation to the voice, but beyond that too. Maybe, Stephen, you look like you want to jump in there.
I'll jump in just because it's this shift that's happened in the past 10 years around don't worry, we're not listening to what you're saying, is still being mobilized in marketing discourse to sell this new frontier of voice technologies. Don't worry, we're only analyzing voice features, so you have no privacy concerns that need to be raised, and no challenge to this fraught consent framework. And the key thing that I've been looking at is this question of why can't we have some kind of informed consent and transparency around the audio data flows beyond the moment where we click agree to microphone access, or we give implied consent on a customer call to that we're notified that the call is going to be recorded. There's no transparency as to how that voice is being analyzed beyond that, even in cases where there's inappropriate purposes of data analysis that are happening and widespread disclosure practices that are occurring. So in my view, like, although like this cornerstone of a data privacy regime and technology ethics, this consent framework it's imperfectly applied all the time, but at the time right now it's kind of a major tool to use to like keep improving, especially when companies are just being allowed to kind of self-regulate. So my approach has been to look at these privacy policies, and like Joe, you laid out on how ridiculous they are and incomprehensible, but they still are like the main piece probably of like transparency around data practices, without the kind of like deep dive analyses that you're doing, Beth, with your ethnographies, getting the insider takes. So they remain an important tool for regulators and for critique.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great place for me to jump in. I mean, I have 2 points that just came up as you were talking, Stephen. One of which is, based off of my own experience of kind of going under the hood of these technologies and seeing how they're made. Because you're right in that so before I joined these labs, I did kind of reach out to people because I was interested in this concept of a vocal biomarker, and I asked people if I could join the lab. And at least one lab that I've written about in an article called Listening Like a Computer said, well, this is a very privacy preserving way of doing mental health screening because we do this work, and when we analyze the speech that we're gathering from people, because you do indeed need to gather speech data from people to build these technologies, we're not listening to the contents, we're just listening to the form. And I thought, oh wow, they must be doing something that I just is above my pay grade in terms of understanding machine learning, machine listening, where they're able to splice apart the form from the content. And actually, in some of the earliest sort of efforts to make vocal biomarker AI that happened in the 1950s, people were pursuing a similar kind of, splicing apart of form and content, and they would quite literally take a waveform and chop up the higher frequency, separate the higher frequency from the lower frequency, and say, we have content-free speech. So this imaginary of the form of voice being more privacy preserving than the content is a long-standing one in sort of speech engineering, communication engineering. But in any event, when I joined this lab, actually one of the chief things that I was doing was doing that separation of form from content. So rather than there being some kind of machine learning magic that's doing that automatically in this particular lab, it was actually a manual task to listen to the contents of people's phone calls. It just so happened to be phone calls of their research subjects, having weekly symptom assessment calls with clinical social workers. The social workers' voices had been removed from the calls, and only the study participants were there. And we were asked to listen to sort of short second-long segments of their calls and just try to only focus on the sounds of their voice and not the content. And as I write about in the article, I had this moment of realizing that, the sort of ethical subject protocol that the research subjects were given said, like, we won't be analyzing the contents of your speech, not your form. Or the other way around, only the form and not the content. And then as somebody who was tasked with doing that manual separation, of course, it's incredibly hard to ignore the contents of what people are saying. And so each of the people who are doing this kind of work, it was me and some undergraduate research assistants, were left in this really ethically and morally fraught position where we didn't want to talk about what we were hearing because we were supposed to preserve the privacy of the research subjects, and yet we could hear it, and we had to kind of sit with the fact that, the premise of the research was really not feasible, the design was very ethically questionable, and that, it was very difficult for us, even amongst each other, to talk about what we're hearing. And to get to Joe's point about the kind of traumatizing nature of the sort of manual labor that's required to build large-scale AI systems was something I experienced firsthand, just how disturbing it was, especially when, the kind of, again, protocol to preserve the subject's privacy is we're not going to talk about what it is that we hear. So this is something I write about in the book manuscript about this project. But one last point about the... Oh, yeah, sure. Oh, no. I was going to say another thing that I think is maybe sort of flips this, okay, it's privacy preserving to focus only on form and not on content on its head, is that in the context of mental health screening, sort of promising to someone that we're not going to be listening to what you're saying, it doesn't really sound so nice, right? So when you're interfacing with the mental health care system, whether consensually or non-consensually, you would presumably want to be heard, and the details of how you're expressing yourself, describing your conditions and your circumstances matter greatly. In fact, there's so many different ways and textures of how one might experience mental distress and causal factors that are so far beyond just things happening in the body. And so a promise to only listen to form is really a promise to flatten away all those very important details. So in another context, it actually becomes about pursuing a very kind of flat imaginary of about what it means to not just listen to someone experiencing mental distress, but sort them and adjudicate whether or not they are quite literally deserving of mental health care resources.
Maybe that's a good segue into what I was going to ask in any case, which is about where things are headed. And I suppose I was wondering about what the nature of consent might be in the kind of imagined commercial applications of this in the context of the privatization of healthcare. And so I suppose I'd like to put it to all the panelists, where you see voice analytics going, maybe what worries you most, maybe in the context of other political forces abroad right now. I mean, perhaps Beth, you go first, but I'm sure that Joe, you'll have plenty to say as well, before maybe kicking back to Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in terms of what sort of concerns me most about the way that these technologies are used in the United States, which is characterized by an increasingly privatized healthcare system that's makes healthcare increasingly inaccessible in pursuit of expanding profits or minimizing costs. What concerns me is that, despite the fact that this sort of scientific consensus about what a vocal biomarker is and does is sort of still an open question, these technologies are being used, and really when they show up, it just becomes another vehicle to, as I was sort of getting at, justify denying people mental health care services. So there's been a long sort of project in the United States of coming up with different sort of actuarial techniques, deciding who does or doesn't deserve care. Virginia Eubanks has written really quite movingly about in the earlier efforts to computerize social welfare services in the US really ended up making things worse for people in pursuit, again, of like expanded efficiency, expanded profits. But I guess more pointedly, in terms of vocal biomarker AI, I will mention that there is a company that no longer calls themselves a vocal biomarker AI company, but they are partnering directly with people within the Trump administration, Mem and Oz, to what is the word they use? The digital modernization program for the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services. So this is an effort to not just kind of in the context of private insurance, which is already quite imbricated with, for instance, I don't have a choice about which health insurance I have via my employer. It's just sort of, I have minimal choice. This is kind of what I got. But now we're talking about sort of federal healthcare infrastructure, this being kind of a part of the system in a way that people cannot opt out of because people quite literally cannot afford other means of insurance coverage. And that is what makes me the most nervous is I increasingly like to think of AI as like an autonomy hoarding machine. And so if we think about AI being operated in this sort of space where people already have limited autonomy and choice or ability to kind of, have their expressions of distress be taken seriously, it starts to be the concept of this being applied within like a federal healthcare infrastructure. It does seem like the people's ability for choices just constricts even further, or for being like heard on their own terms, so to speak.
And Joe, where do you see things heading? What's concerning you most, occupying most of your thinking on the voice?
Well, let me start with a quote that I found that a consulting firm, I think it was used, said, "We are moving toward a curated reality where AI agents act as gatekeepers." Okay. Now they said it in a relatively positive sense, but that curated reality will to some extent be curated through a person's voice and to the agent. Okay. So more and more people are going to be dealing with agents that talk to them. And agents will be talking to bots that are supposed to reflect the voice, the tone, the profile of the person, him or herself, or themselves. And it's weird to try to think this stuff through, but realize we've only been in the internet, commercial internet world for about 20 years. What's it going to look like in 15? And one of the things that I'm pretty sure is going to happen is that, for example, this month, Microsoft came out with something it calls brand agents. And what brand agents are bots that are AI related bots that are specifically related to a particular company. That company trains the bots that Microsoft helps them do that. And then it uses those bots to convince particular customers who come to the website, the app, to purchase certain products. It shows them particular products. It moves them through the purchasing. It explains the products to them. And when they get into the area of purchase, it will actually try to encourage them to purchase if it looks like they're not sure they want to do it. Okay.
Just to be explicit,
Sorry.
well, just to be explicit, so the idea is that the sort of ability to target will be based partly on voice analytics.
That's what I'm suggesting.
Many other things, but also that sometimes this will be via a text interface, on the website, but sometimes it will be via a smart speaker or in your car,
Exactly.
or through some kind of voice interface.
And eventually people will want to do that because they will be told that this is the best way to get the best advice. If you speak to the speaker, it'll say, "Good morning, Joe." I mean, Alexa says that to me now. So if it can help you walk through the various purchases in this way, customized in this way, what we're moving toward, and we can talk about this more in a little bit. My argument here in this new book, it's a privacy issue, obviously. It's a discrimination issue in that you may get better deals than someone else based on the profile that they have of you, some of which may have to do with your Brooklyn accent or non-Brooklyn accent. But some of it may relate to the idea, not just the separating people out from one another, so that you will see a different world from me because the profiles that companies have about me and the bots that they have talking to me will show me a very different world. Already, if you go to the New York Times, you see different stories on the front page than I do because they know that you're interested in different things. Who says that the headlines you see won't be different down the line because they know that you click on certain things and get engaged with certain things? Some of that engagement may have to do with voice engagement.
I've been doing some work recently on the Meta Ray-Ban collaboration and a project they have called Project Aria, which is kind of the research back end of the future of smart glasses.
Yeah.
Smart glasses, the Project Aria kind of prototype glasses have 7 directional microphones on them. And so machine listening and voice analytics are going to be deeply integrated into the kind of first person perspective, kind of pseudo metaverse overlay that smart glasses, which are now really starting to kick off, are beginning to bring into being.
People will take it for granted. See, now people are still typing oriented in many, many cases. But the more you get into the glasses, the more you get into various kinds of goggles, the more you walk around stores and talk to devices on shelves, voice will become part of the everyday life of giving up your data.
Stephen, I don't know if it's too much to point to you for the hope story or something, because I mean, we've talked about some of the political problems, privatized healthcare, the fracturing of community, increasing personalization and sort of fracturing. What do you see in your work are the kind of the points of agency for us as political actors, researchers, activists, what have you right now? Like what's going on regulation wise, and what should we be getting behind on this topic at the moment in Canada or otherwise?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing for me is a real community-oriented advocacy model around privacy. Like I think that's a key thing for people to kind of get angry about some of these concerns, and but not just for themselves, but to think about some of these more vulnerable groups and the consent issues around those spaces. For instance, like many of these systems, like they're blatantly marketed for low socioeconomic status groups, majority world applications. So it's this vulnerable populations that are most going to be targeted by these systems. So it's the hopeful story, hopefully, is that we need to be thinking about our fellow citizens in this way and advocating for privacy protections for collective betterment. This is, I don't think, just rosy glasses, but I think it's a pragmatic approach to not equate privacy with individualistic rights. It's social protection and human rights protections. But I also think we need to, like in Canada at least, we need to kind of stand firm, take inspiration through like what we see in the European Union with not only GDPR but the AI Act. Is a completely different approach to regulating these kinds of technologies, a risk-based approach that can carve out like clear prohibitions around certain uses, like a voice monitoring of stress and burnout in the workplace being one. Like that seems blatantly ridiculous. So I think we need to kind of stand firm and like not buckle to kind of just a self-regulated approach that we're trying to resist from Silicon Valley and these American startups that are popping up.
But just
further.
to be clear, you're saying that the kind of AI ethics approach, which foregrounds company, agency, and so on, is part of the problem. So the kind of the AI ethics self-regulation framework is like not what we should be doing.
Yeah, I don't think so. Like first of all, like transparency is like thought of as like a sunlight in this case, but many of these actors, they operate quite opaquely. Not to mention they're really great at spinning transparency into something palatable, like these privacy washing tactics we talked about around we don't listen to what you talk about. So I think that's not going to be sufficient. It's just going to be inevitable risk and harms to vulnerable groups.
Can I be a bit more pessimistic?
Yeah.
Please go.
Yeah, I first of all, people don't know anything about this stuff. We've done surveys from 1999 to 2021, 9 of them, national surveys by major survey companies, and it is unbelievable how much lack of knowledge there is. So, for example, most Americans, this is in the U.S., most Americans think that it is illegal to charge people different prices for the same products at the same time online. It's amazing how little education. I have taught hundreds of students in intro courses. In a class of 100 students, there may be 2 who've taken high school classes that teach them anything about this stuff. The EU is backtracking. They're scared that all of their laws have made it so that they're non-competitive. So increasingly, they're trying to get away from a lot of the stuff that they've had before. And in the US, what's happening is you have a situation of a combination, as I said before, of seduction and bullying. For example, a lot of people now have browsers that allow them to stop ads, right? And you've probably gotten a company, I don't know if you've seen Admiral, which encourages you to let the ads come on. It'll say, please, we make our money through ads. They don't say we also take an enormous amount of information. Let us use the ad. Sometimes the link will go on even if you say no. But they use artificial intelligence to decide whether that page is of interest to people and specifically of interest to you. So somebody else might be able to get into that page and you might not, based upon their evaluation of whether it's useful to bully you to accept ads for that page. Okay? So we see so many things happening around the way in which people deal with their data and companies try to seduce and bully them. It's very, very complicated. And I think it's going to get more and more complicated because of the difficulties of understanding what you guys are talking about. How many people understand what timbre is with voice? How many people know what it means to look into somebody's body and get data that's meaningful?
I do think
Speaking of body,
I do think with
go ahead,
people
Stephen.
interacting with more of these things like AI hiring systems, like uh, particularly youth are quite aware of these things. Like maybe not at the same depth and like the degree of new applications, but at the same time, like the reason why I the hopeful take I made with community-minded privacy advocacy. I think it's because you talk to undergrads and younger folks, and you get the impression that you do not care about privacy. However, in general, younger generations care a great deal about social justice. So I think it's reframing these privacy problems as social justice concerns, because that becomes a much more compelling advocacy take.
I hope you're right. The first they have to know what they're talking about. And
Right.
that's
There,
Beth?
part of the problem.
is there time for me to jump in with a
Yes,
maybe one
please, and
more
then we'll go to
hopeful,
questions.
just one more hopeful tip? I mean, in terms of what gives me hope is that I think, Stephen, as you were saying, kind of maybe reframing privacy conversations, and Joe, to your point as well about education. I'm deeply inspired by all of the organizing that's being done by tech workers, kind of across the AI production pipeline. So this is from technologists at big tech companies who are walking out and organizing against the complicity of their companies in the genocide in Gaza, to people at the farther end, people doing the kind of content moderation work that Joe was talking about, who are also organizing. There's a really, really wonderful project that is kind of led by Milagros Myceli called the Data Workers Inquiry, that's really gathering people who are kind of at the brunt end of these systems, the ones who are going to be directly processing people's content, sharing their experiences, and really providing insight into a lot of the kind of existing or unknown privacy issues. So, issues that wouldn't necessarily be known by the user end, but because these people are deep in the innards of the technology, they have this kind of deep insight into a lot of its issues. And so, I find that really inspiring, and I think there's a great capacity for that type of work to do really, really important political education. I have a graduate student of mine who is working with unions as well, doing political education on technology. So I think because there is, especially among younger generation, much more of a kind of anger about AI than, I would have necessarily expected.
Yeah.
But I find it very, very inspiring. And I find this work that's being done really around the world, kind of organizing from a very like multi-coalitional perspective, really, really has a lot of potential in terms of providing that kind of political education about these technologies.
Thanks so much, Beth. We are right on the hour, and so I've been instructed that Ange has been gathering questions behind the scenes for any audience members who have yet to put one into the Q&A window. Maybe now is the time to do so, but I do gather we've got a bunch already, Ange. Would you be willing to share some with us?
Yeah, I do want to remind the attendees that you can use the Q&A button to ask questions to the panelists. The first question is from an attendee, and they say, I've changed my personal voicemail to an automated voice rather than my own personal voice, as I've had a lot of scam calls lately, and I've read articles where AI is mocking people's voices for scamming purposes. Is there any comments from the panelists on this?
Yeah, this is a real concern. The voice cloning issues. There's been cases of fraud in Canada, but yeah, I haven't had any like clear indication of like how pervasive it is, but certainly we can see things even like the agentic AI that Joe you were speaking about, like this kind of compounding the problem when people are like increasingly it's normalized to use an AI agent to conduct your affairs. So this raises all sorts of voice cloning concerns.
Yeah,
But yeah,
I've even thought about this, what we're doing now. I mean, I read the text of my new book, the audio, and I got to think, well, can't someone use that to train somebody on my voice for a deep fake?
Hmm.
But they can do it on what we're doing right now.
Right.
It might
So
be
there are so many. Yes, I have heard that about phone calls, people speaking into the phone, and that's another reason people say don't answer calls you don't know.
Right.
You know, but it
It
isn't.
might be worth maybe just being explicit about a slight shift in register that's happened here. So we've gone from sort of voice analytics, vocal biomarkers, maybe accent or affect, health detection, and so on, to voice generation, which is really kind of, the generative AI era really has hit voice. Some of the
Yeah,
big companies would be, for example, 11 Labs, but of
yeah,
course, Google and everybody has their own uh, versions, and these are now cheap or free in some cases. You need something like a couple of seconds. I've used 11 Labs a bit for kind of to study it. And you can make a kind of a clone with a very, very small sample of quite
yes,
low grade voice. Now, it's not exactly a voice clone in the sense of it doesn't sound like me. It sounds like the me in the very small bit of audio I gave. And also, it kind of glitches and fails and misfires in all sorts of ways.
Right.
But that is a freely accessible technology. It's not just, I don't know, uh, organized crime
Right.
or like malevolent groups. You can just get it. So the voice clone thing and the kinds of privacy, I mean, 11 Labs and other companies like it ask you to just sort of say that you have the right to use the voice in
Right. Right.
question. And you just go,
well,
oh, yeah,
Michael
I
Caine
do.
has sold his voice to 11 Labs.
Right.
You
No,
know,
there are many. Yeah. I mean, that is a big thing coming. The audiobooks thing, the kind of personalized podcast, Notebook LM, which is a Google product for students, which I grow increasingly rageful about because it's basically a kind of product for cheating at university. We'll do podcasts and things based on the journal articles and books and things you submit to it. So generative voice, personalized generative voice is a major thing, and obviously cloning and uh, gives a kind of uh, a privacy or security risk angle to it. But I'd say that there are many other issues in terms of the ways it's disrupting industries and sort of, yeah, reproducing relations with text, our sense of selves, our sense of community, and so on. Did anybody else want to comment on that question about, yeah, scams and so on before we throw to the next question? Beth, did you? Or anybody else to come back in?
hmm.
No? Okay, Ange, fire away.
Okay, the next question. Somebody asks, they say Amazon newly launched Alexa's Sidewalk for their Echo devices to improve identification of local devices and internet connections. Will this only add to potential invasions of privacy?
It could. I don't think that most people know exactly what Sidewalk will do, but it's
Could you
supposed
say a
to
little bit
help.
more about what Sidewalk is? Because I actually am not familiar with it.
Sure, it's not as new as I think the person is implying. What I understand it is if you get an Amazon doorbell, for example, the danger is that danger in quotes is that it won't work because it's too far away from your house's internal internet. So you use the internet of your next door neighbor in order to make it work. And some people are worried that therefore you can piggyback on their Wi-Fi, either use too much of it or maybe get inside their Wi-Fi and use it.
Mhm.
I don't know enough about the privacy technology there, the security technology to say, but it is clear to me that there are uh, companies and people that are trying to inject things into various bots and ways to get into your various internet and computer facilities that I guess Sidewalk could be used for if one was strong enough and smart enough to do that.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Stephen, did you want to come in? I mean, in a way, it's like it doesn't feel like a voice question exactly, although the echo as a kind of Trojan horse for all
Yeah,
sorts of
that's
other
what
privacy
the idea
invasions.
is. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, Beth.
Yeah, I was actually going to say something that was inspired by something that you said, Stephen, which is that, what I wasn't familiar with Sidewalk, but it makes me think a lot of the Amazon Ring and their partnership with Flock, which is an automated license plate reader, which does have very sort of unclear to, I think, many people plans to have like some sort of like aggression detection technology,
Right.
which is like
Mhm.
the premise behind that is that it's a version of this technology is sometimes used in the states in schools as a kind of school shooting mitigation technology where it is supposed to be able to detect like or violence mitigating technology. It's supposed to be able to detect sort of stress in the voice and send a kind of as a way to decide where to funnel like police presence basically. But what makes me nervous about these technologies, and I think in light of something that Joe, you said about the kind of triangulation that they enable, is the way that triangulation, it might not be, necessarily directly threatening or sort of, do much for an individual user, but in the aggregate, it makes it a lot easier for like the example that I'm kind of funneling towards is like the way that ICE has made use of these technologies to really kind of up their targeting of particular people. So it's the availability of other people's, let's say,
Mhm.
Ring doorbells or Flock cameras in Home Depot, which is like a I don't know if Home Depot is known by the Canadians, but
Yeah, it
it's
is.
like a okay, great, thank you for showing my cards about not knowing much about I don't know hardware stores in Canada. But what is concerning is that the more of those technologies are out there and owned by people, the easier it becomes to kind of triangulate people who
Right.
who don't necessarily they don't have the same kind of relationship to privacy because they're like hyper visible and already being hyper targeted. I
It's
mean,
the
Hmm.
networking of a neighborhood, which has
exactly.
both positive and negative implications.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think, Stephen, to your point about that, a lot of the privacy regulation needs to be less focused on a kind of individualized model and more on operating through a more communitarian ethos. That's not just about, the classic, like, well, I mean, post Snowden, well, I have nothing to say. I have nothing to hide.
Hmm.
You can listen to my calls, but it's because it's not ever just about the individual. It's about
Hmm.
the triangulation of those data points in aggregate to
Hmm.
be
I'm not
able
sure if
to
you've
heighten. Yeah.
I'm not sure if you've seen this Meta project. It's called Live Maps, and the idea is that you would sort of produce in real time a sort of much more fine-grained version of like Google Maps via your smart glasses. So Google Maps just gets the street view, right? Whereas
Mm.
the idea is with Live Maps is that multiple community members all wearing the Meta Ray-Bans would be constantly producing a kind of a live and updating map of the city with all of the various different, commercial and other forms of data that might produce. And that's kind of, but I think people have this idea that like the metaverse is sort of dead because we
Mhm.
don't currently sit in meetings with like
Right.
AV goggles on or something. But a hell of a lot of money is going into kind of um,
Right.
augmented reality and
Yeah.
the rise of the smart glasses as a form of interface, which includes a lot of machine listening and voice analytics. It is something worth paying attention to because the
Yes.
sales are exploding at a level that are comparable to smart speakers, albeit that they're much more expensive devices for now. So you're not going to see
And
quite
I'm
the
pretty sure that Meta enfolded some of that into their AI group. In other
Mm.
words, it's the glasses are part of the AI group now. I'm pretty
yeah,
sure.
it's called Meta Reality Labs. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Now, Stephen, were you opening your mouth to jump in, or
I
will we
was
go
just
to the
gonna
next
I
question
was
from
just gonna
Anne?
say like even with this AR wearable paradigm, the early adopters they have major impact on other people's privacy, right? When you're these cases you're describing of the entire sidewalk being exposed in real time, among other things, right?
Ange, where would you like us to go next?
Yeah, I have another question. And this question is for you. Sorry, for you, James. You referred several times to Snowden's revelations. For those who don't know the details, what was remarkable about what he revealed about what personal data was being collected?
Okay. Well, that's a big question, which I'm not necessarily like, I've not got all of the names of the programs and everything on the tip of my tongue. But basically, the idea was that the US government, via collaborations and backdoors with Skype, which was owned by Microsoft. I have to be careful about naming exactly the companies, but it's sort of all the big tech players, but maybe not a couple, were hoovering up. Verizon and other telecoms providers were basically collecting vast volumes of calls made in and out of the US according to very sort of loose definitions of being connected in some way with a security risk, right? So they weren't meant to be just collecting every phone call, but if there was some like second or third hand potential link to some kind of security risk, then they could hoover up your calls. Now, those calls were immediately and automatically transcribed at scale, producing these sort of vast troves, archives of global telecoms communications, and then via targeted keyword searching, were kind of mined for potential security problems. So, I don't know, the word bomb or something, or you can imagine how certain kind of racialized or religiously motivated angles might be sort of taken on there. And so I suppose the shock of it at the time was that this was even possible. So as I think it's in 2013 that like this enormous, vast, numbers like billions that we hadn't really seen before, and that this was happening, that it was supposedly legal. There were various um, uh, sort of judicial orders that had authorized supposedly various parts of it. But there was basically a global eavesdropping network and system in place, and that this was part of what Snowden
Mhm.
exposed. There were many other aspects of it. There were supposedly like we haven't talked about voice IDs so much today, but there were supposedly voice identification technologies, very early versions being applied to those calls and so on. And at the time, this was a very big scandal. Within a year or so, Amazon Echo had dropped and was trying to, and we had very quickly introduced the kinds of technologies that were premised on this kind of voice, scaled voice collection. We were buying them at sort of cut down prices as Christmas presents for each other within a year or two. And it
Yeah.
was sort of shocking to anybody who was like paying close attention. And my students don't know about the Snowden revelations anymore. It's a sort of they might have heard of it, but in the same way that they've heard of, and I don't want to patronize my students, but it's like part of history, like the Cold War or something.
Mhm.
And
Right, right.
so to have lived through it and to have had the sort of different experience of being shocked by data collection. I don't think that my students have that experience anymore. And there is a kind of a fatalism. And Joe, you've written about this as part of the dynamic of production of consent, a certain kind of produced resignation that we just we just assume on on one level, nobody knows about this stuff. We're not experts on voice analytics. And on another level, we've all been encouraged to be resigned to the reality that probably everything is being collected all the time. And it's a very difficult and sort of disempowering political dynamic, I think.
We haven't talked, and we probably won't because it's a totally different part of the world, but we haven't talked about China and all of the things that are normalized in China with respect to government activity. There are concerns in China, as there are, for example, in the US about marketers and the collection of data by marketers. But in China, the back end of every marketer has to be open to the government. And there are discussions, for example, the language that Uyghurs use and the detection of whether a person is a Uyghur or not a Uyghur or a member of some other ethnic group is something that has become normative there in terms of what the government is doing. Again, I don't know enough about what's going on in China, but it's often an area that we leave out when we talk about these sorts of things. It's a different kind of world with a different set of norms and governmental regulations that China is trying to encourage other countries to use as well, using their own technology. So I'm just bringing that up as another part of this evolving system.
Any of you want to come in on this, or anything I was saying about Snowden?
I think you covered it well.
Okay, I'm sorry that I don't have the details to hand. All of the programs had malevolent, evil-sounding names like
Prism, right?
Prism.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes,
Prism was
yeah,
right. That's the big one, Prism.
yeah. And do you have another question ready for us? I gather there's quite a few coming in now.
Yeah, there's some more questions. The next question, an attendee says, on the radio airwaves, there are a multitude of continual voice transmissions. Assuming these voices are cloned, is there an encryption process to prevent criminal intent? Enforcement and conviction of such crimes would be elusive.
That's a tricky one because I mean, I haven't thought specifically about radio as a kind of archive of voices. To me, the more pertinent sort of example in a way would be like YouTube or
Mm.
something. But just because it's so easy to just grab a YouTube file and plonk it into something like 11 Labs. So if we're talking about kind of voice theft or something, there's a ready archive. We don't need to get into the hassle of grabbing them off radio. One thing I would also maybe add for people who haven't engaged with voice cloning interfaces or voice generation interfaces is that um, they have an enormous archive of voices in there already, and you can build your own. You can literally like give voice characteristics and stuff, which is not exactly the same as voice cloning, but it is, voice maybe masking, or it opens up the possibility of, other forms of deception or misrepresentation by means of voice. And so, I mean, not to say that the question isn't a good one in terms of radio, but I would just say my immediate reaction is that it sounds like a bit of a hassle to get the voice off a radio, basically, when there are many other ready-made voices waiting there to be used and abused.
Yeah, I certainly can't speak to, criminals using these kinds of data sets, but there's also evidence of these health-related voice companies using YouTube, right, for initial model development and so forth.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, one anecdote I like to give is about a very sort of foundational data set in machine listening, which is called audio set. And audio set is for any of the audience who have, heard of ImageNet, maybe that's kind of the famous, the really the first data set where people realize that you can get a machine learning system to do quite accurate image recognition. Well, audio set is the kind of audio equivalent for identifying, distinguishing human speech from non-human speech, different vocal sounds, coughs, screams, baby cries, but also animal sounds and vehicles and everything. Now that data set was produced and made public by Google using YouTube. So YouTube was bought by Google however many years ago now, and obviously, did I say that the right way around? YouTube was
Yeah.
bought by Google how many years ago, and it became a kind of um, a ready-made data set or a something that could be easily transformed into a data set, and that data set, in the case of audio set, is constantly used by researchers and companies, and you can download it now and do whatever you want with it for the purposes of doing all sorts of machine listening and developing other techniques. And And it's very instructive to do that, by the way. One thing we haven't talked about, I suppose, is data sets. And Beth, you've done some amazing work on like the production of data sets. And I think going into something like audio set is really interesting because it's so weird. The data set is so weird to actually spend some time in a data set and say, this is what everything is trained on. So it will have like, 50,000 gunshots, but like only 150 examples of a cough or something. You're like, that's weird. Why has it got that? And what does that mean for how it's been? Like African music is a category, right? Now that's in the data set. Like you could sort of automatically detect the entirety of African music as if it was a coherent thing. Like what a weird like category. But then at the same time, you've got like male speech indoors
Right.
or
It's
something like this.
algorithmic bias is what it is.
And so like, just to spend time looking at a data set to understand how they're produced and to begin to imagine all of the downstream effects, especially when these are coming from kind of very sort of messy places like YouTube is quite an interesting exercise, I think, for people to go through. You can go on audio set and just hang out in it right now. I recommend it. Beth, did you want to jump in on anything like that?
I mean, it's a bit of a tangent where I teach a class called the Anthropology of AI, and it's not quite about voice data sets, but about sort of data set creation in general. And the students towards the end of the class had come up with this activity where they had everyone in the class go on this site where you don't know on the site. We were talking about Turing's imitation game, and you don't know on the site if you're talking to a bot or you're like, an LLM, or if you're talking to a person. And the students had a great deal of fun, especially because it turned out two people in the class happened to be paired with each other without them realizing. So it was, yeah, no, it was lots of fun. And then we started asking, like, well, what is this? Where are these LLMs coming from? Because we had questions about the nature of the bot generated responses, which were surprisingly students felt like accurate, or rather, they couldn't tell that they were a bot. And then what we learned is actually that the interface is helping to train a large variety of large language models, because part of what you do, the challenge is you click, is this a bot or is this not a bot? And so we kind of all had this moment of like, oh, okay, this entire fun gamified thing is actually just a giant data set creation vehicle. We are, fine tuning this data set, helping to introduce, very hyper specific, like young people slaying into the data set, right, through the kind of saying like, yes, no, this is a bot, this is not a bot. And I had remarked to the students that like, well, typically doing this sort of, pruning and discerning work is a person's job, but isn't it so great because we played a game, we did it for free. So it is often the case that a lot of these data sets are generated through that kind of like bait and switch, where it's like, it's a fun game, or it's not a fun game at all. It's a harrowing and terrible job. But just to, I guess, add more to make it a little less, again, terrible, to add to the weirdness of the voice data sets, there's another very commonly used voice data set. It's one, I think, generated by like academic labs, or one lab that's used very often in emotion voice recognition in particular. And just looking at the amalgamation of sources that they drew from, it includes things like German talk shows, and then also people's conversations with, again, I'm aging myself here, but I don't know if y'all remember that robot dog Aibo. It was like very early 2000s. And so there was one lab somewhere that was recording children's conversations with the dog. That's also somehow in this data set. So if you just think about, like James is saying, the kind of large diversity, all kinds of questions about the choices that were made to select that data and prune it, really being compressed into a data set that then is being used to do similar kind of work. There's just so many little instances of highly subjective, culturally contextual, or, biased, misogynistic, all other kinds of words that could be used to describe the content on YouTube, sort of compressed into these systems.
Yeah, they're scarfing up everything they can because they need the largest large language models they possibly can make. Which gets to the thing that another thing we can't deal with today, but I guess we should maybe everybody thinks about it anyway. The energy uses of this. The fact that everything we're talking about is destroying the ecosystem just by the very nature of its activities.
Oh, don't worry, actually, Joe, because it will become so smart and within a few years, it's actually going to solve
You
the
solved the
environmental
problem? Okay.
crisis.
Well, I
They've got
mean,
that sorted.
Amazon is buying small nuclear reactors,
Right.
and Microsoft, I think, has just bought 3 Mile Island, and it's
Um,
just that's the level of craziness that we're at as a result of this.
and I'm conscious there's only 3 or 4 minutes left. Perhaps have you got a sort of a couple of questions you could cluster together for us, and then I could just put it to the panel to see which of them if that sort of feel mo most happy responding to.
Well, sorry, it'd be I could
Yeah,
just
I caught you
I
off
don't think we're
guard.
going to get to all of the questions, so
Yeah.
yeah, but we
It's
can maybe
nice that so many people had questions.
yeah.
Yeah.
I'll just go with the next one right now. I think it's an interesting one, and other people will, I think, as well. An attendee said, I recently saw that someone called into Verizon and they were being taxed a $10 US fee for a person-to-person conversation instead of using automation for a new plan. Would love to hear the panelists' thoughts on monetary fees to avoid automation and AI.
I mean, that's fascinating. I've never had an example of that, but I get the idea is that human engagement becomes a luxury commodity, basically. And the sort of bedrock assumption is that you will always be engaging with with a bot of some kind. But if you want to, you can pay to speak with a real flesh and blood human. Any of you come across anything like this or got any comments on that specific anecdote?
No, I mean the whole question of call centers and the internationalization of call centers is a really interesting subject in itself. It's trying to go to countries where you have to pay the least of people to do that work. And
Mm.
clearly, in the end, the hope is that it'll all be mechanized, so that the people in Belize won't be doing it. Some company will have servers in Belize that will be doing it.
Beth?
Yeah, to Joe's point, there's several companies that sell like accent producing technology,
Right.
but that's a whole other thing. But not quite what this person is talking about. But I did just see recently Meta has come up with some sort of performance metric where if you use AI more in your coding, then it has some sort of performance benefits, and there's a whole tracking system. So there's actually now an incentivization by people within Meta to use AI in their coding practices. So it's not quite the same thing, but it's sort of a version of it where it's kind of forced engagement with AI. Um, for a price, whether that be, a customer having to pay a premium or a worker having their, performance review be
Yeah.
considered poor if they're not engaging enough with AI.
I mean,
Yeah.
that raises a real interesting question of when everybody has their business so dedicated to AI, how can they go against it? It's really very difficult if you know that your next job or the next level of your job is an AI level. Um, what do you do? How do you speak against that technology?
I was just going to add, like, this is, of course, a much wider problem of like us being forced to adopt AI in various places. I haven't heard the specific example of paying to have a real human being, but it's similar things with like students complaining with professors using AI in the classroom when they're paying so much for their education, and
Hmm.
AI is being used to design the curriculum, or they're being forced to use AI in assignments. So it's a similar problem.
And do we have time for one last question?
Yeah, there's actually been a couple questions about regulations, so I'll get those in. And they are, although you said the EU is under attack for its regulations, what are some key regulations that you feel we could urge for the Canadian government to adopt? And how can we protect ourselves from different types of privacy violations?
I feel like maybe you're the right one to take on this question in the first instance, Stephen.
Yeah, well, the key thing with the AI Act in the EU is a risks-based framework, right? So there's a typology of risk there that determines how different AI applications, in depending on the context, get treated and get regulated. So my understanding is like there's unacceptable risks, like clear human rights violations, or like predictable negative outcomes. that are unacceptable in some contexts. In the EU, this is like emotion recognition applications in workplaces and schools, I believe. So similar things can be adapted in a Canadian context or wherever you might go. But then there's also like serious risk applications which need to go through rigorous privacy audits and like human rights audits before they get released. They can get piloted at first. So there's a risk adverse approach as opposed to just steamrolling through with invasive applications in every single context imaginable. Yeah.
I have a few bizarro ones, if you don't mind. One that may not be so bizarre is that if a company is using technology, for example, to look at your voice for an ad, it should have an icon on that ad that says that, and that you should be able to click to find out what exactly that company is doing and where it got the inferences about you. And if it can't tell you that, if it's a black box, it shouldn't be able to do it. The second thing I would suggest is that people should be able to take on, in this case, the voices or the persona of other people to find out what it's like. So if I want to be a black woman in Mississippi for a day, I should be able to ask companies to tell me, to show me the world through my various devices digitally on the internet of any sort that a black woman who's 25 years old in Mississippi would get, okay? So that I can see another world through other people's eyes. Otherwise, we're just living in our own little worlds, okay? The same thing, it would be great if companies were forced in some way, and we could talk about how that would possibly be, to make it so that on certain days of the week, everybody would get the same thing. So we could share stuff together and fight about what individual groups think and don't think about certain things. I mean, the real problem, I would argue, in society more and more is that we're into mono areas of life. We're being defined in such a monolithic way that we don't know what it's like to be other people. And so I think that it's important to try to find ways to alert people when they're being siloed like that, and then give them opportunities to get out of it so they can see what the rest of the world is like.
Beth, do you have a political or legislative or regulatory horizon that you like to bang the drum for?
Well, difficult to posit speaking from the United States at this current moment. But I don't know if it was you, James, or Lauren Sabu-Hamdan or your work together. But I'm really inspired by some suggestions that like the state of Illinois did a very good job at combating the use of voice biometrics in commercial spaces. Likewise, they've done a very good job at making what I would say is the best regulation as far as banning the use of sort of AI mediated therapy writ large.
Right.
But I like the framing of, rather than going at this from the perspective of illegal search and seizure, going at it from the perspective of the right to remain silent, because what constitutes speech or some sort of, active speech with something like voice biometrics, voice AI has become so expansive that now utterances that were not even intended to be speech as such, like sounds, now can be perhaps considered some sort of evidentiary, I don't know, something in a variety of contexts. So I think that the kind of right to remain silent is an underutilized legislative apparatus, at least in the US, as a way to combat voice AI, voice biometrics writ large. And I do believe that this is something that I was inspired by reading something from you. So credit goes where credit is due.
Thank you so much. Well, we've had so much to talk about that we've run slightly over time. Jim, would you like to jump back in to finally wrap us up?
Yes, I would. Thank you so much. I really want to thank the panel for a very engaging conversation over these issues, and you can see the interest you generated in the audience. There are many more questions that we didn't even get to. So thank you so much. And I want to thank the audience for their engagement. I hope you enjoyed it as much, found it as meaningful as I did. So thank you so much. I also want to mention what is going to be our next event, which is going to be a week from tonight on Wednesday, February 10th at 7 p.m., and where we're going to look at the issue of online verification. As you know, there are Australia and now France, and there are plans in Canada to bring in the requirement for verification. And there are a lot of good reasons these are being proposed, but we're going to look at what are some of the serious dangers posed by it and what are some alternatives. Our guest is going to be David Green, who is the Senior Counsel for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And he's going to be in conversation with Evan Light, who is an associate professor of policy studies at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Information. So that conversation will be next Wednesday, a week tonight at 7 p.m. The video of tonight's panel will be posted on the CFE website tomorrow, along with a series of suggested readings and other resources that if you got interested in what you were hearing tonight, you can pursue. So please, if you enjoyed this, recommend it to any of your colleagues or friends or networks. The CFE website is cfe.torontomu.ca. So again, thank you to the panel and thank you to the audience for tonight. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.